Hello everybody, today we are looking at how to find the rule for a linear equation from a table or a graph. So a rule is anything that has y equals on one side and then an x on the other side. So we've got two variables that we are discussing, and it's describing the relationship between an x coordinate and a y coordinate. And this can be done from a table or directly from a graph. So in terms of our rule, okay, the thing that we have in front of the x, we call this the coefficient. Okay, so remember in algebra, the coefficient is the number that goes before a letter. So this is the coefficient of x. And the number that's on its own, all right, remember we call that the constant term. Okay. In linear graphing, the constant term is what value of y does x equal 0. Okay, that's going to make more sense in a moment when I give you an example. The coefficient section is what we call our gradient. So it's looking at the increase in our y value if our x value is increasing by 1. Okay, so over here, we can see our x values. Our x values are going up by 1 each time. So each time that x goes up 1, so from -2 to -1 to 0 to 1 to 2, there's a difference of 1 between that. We're looking at the difference of our y value. So if x increases by 1, what's happening to our y value? So if we look over here, to go from the number -1 to 1, we are going and adding 2. So we need to see the pattern that we're following. To go from 1 to 3, we have to add 2. Okay. To go from 3 to 5, we have to add 2. To go from 5 to 7, we add 2. So when we write a rule, what we always do is we first see that our x values are increasing by 1. If our x values are increasing by 1, amazing, it means we can follow this working out. So we now see what's happening to our y values. So as x increases by 1, how many does y increase or decrease by? In this case, y is increasing by 2. So what we're going to do to write our rule is we're basically filling in the blanks of here. So y is going to equal this increase or decrease, whatever's happening here, this number is what's going to go in front of the x. So we're going to have that as 2x. And then what's going to happen is we're going to look and try to figure out what our constant term is. Now our constant term is going to be the value of y when x equals to 0. So if we look at where x equals to 0, there's x equals 0. What's our y value? It's a +3, means I'm going to write a +3. And I have now written my rule. I have figured out the rule from a table. Let's look at another example. So over here, I'm going to look and see if my x's are increasing by 1. Yes, they are. All right, let's now try to figure out what my pattern is. So how do I go from 1 to 0? What's going on? I am subtracting 1. So to go from 1 to 0, we subtract 1. To go from 0 to -1, we subtract 1. To go from -1 to -2, we subtract 1. To go from -2 to, this should actually be -3. Over here, that was my error with writing the question. Okay, we subtract 1. Beautiful. So we have now figured out what our coefficient is going to be. So again, we write the rule the same way that we would. Y equals, what's our coefficient? Our coefficient is -1. We write an x. And we see what is our constant. Remember, our constant is where x equals to 0. That's the value. So when x equals to 0, y is -1. So our constant is going to be -1. Now, another way that we can write this, okay, this is going to be the same as me writing y equals, instead of the -1 being there, I can just write -x, take away 1 as well. Okay, so both of these things are exactly the same. Alrighty, let's now have a look at this one over here. So we again are going to see that our x values are increasing by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yep, they're going up by 1. So let's see what our pattern is. And our pattern over here, from 5 to 7, we are adding 2, 7 to 9, adding 2, 9 to 11, adding 2. Beautiful. So we can now figure out our rule. That value is going to be our coefficient. So we have figured out that it's going to be y equals 2x plus our constant term, plus a value. And we're going to have to try to now figure out what that constant term is going to be. So let's now look. Oh, there's no 0 up here. So how are we going to do it? Well, what we have to do is we have to choose one of these points and try to figure out what the blank is going to be. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to substitute one of these coordinates. So say I take the coordinate 2 and 5. Let's do it in a different color. So I'm going to take the coordinate 2 and 5. So 2 is my x coordinate, 5 is my y coordinate. So my rule here, I've got y, which is my 5, equals 2 times my x coordinate, which is 2, plus a number. Okay, so 5 equals 4 plus a number. What is 4 plus something to give me 5? 4 plus what gives me 5? We know that 4 plus 1 gives us 5, okay? Which means this missing number in here is going to be my value. That is going to be a 1. So my rule for this table that I've got over here is going to be y equals 2x plus 1. All right, let's go through 2 more examples following the same process. So we look at our x values. Are they going up by 1? Yes, they are. So now I can see what's happening with my y values. So how do I go from -8 to -5? How do I go from -5 to -2, from -2 to 1, from 1 to 4? You're going to notice that we are adding 3 each time. So if we are adding 3 each time, that means my rule is going to be y equals my coefficient, which we figured out is 3 times x, plus my constant term. My constant term I'm going to figure out by looking and seeing if there's a 0. Oop, there's a 0. The y value is -2, which means my constant term here, instead of being plus a value, because our value is negative, it's going to be -2. And I have figured out the value, my rule value for this particular table. All right, let's now look at this last one over here. We are increasing by 1 on our x-axis, which is great. So let's look at see what's happening with our y-axis to go from -5 to -7 to -9 to -11 to -13. You will notice that we are subtracting 2 each time, which means my coefficient is going to be -2 multiplied by x. And we're now going to try to figure out what our constant term is. So we're going to look at our x. Oh no, there's no 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to take one coordinate. Let's take this one, 3, -5. -5 to try to figure out what is going on. So let's go solve this equation. Let's say y is equal to -5 equals -2 times my x coordinate, which is 3, plus my constant. Let's call our constant c this time. Okay, we're now using algebra to solve for c. So -5 equals -2 times 3 is -6 plus c. To get c on its own, I have to move this -6 to the other side. Remember, to get rid of that, if it's negative here, I've got to add it to both sides. So if I add 6 to here, going to cancel, so I'm going to add 6 again to the other side. -5 plus 6 equals to 1. Therefore, my constant term, or my constant value, is going to be a 1. So I'm going to add a 1 to the end of that. Okay, so just as a summary, we first off find our coefficient by seeing the difference in our y value as long as our x values are increasing by 1. And we see our constant term by looking at which x value gives us which y value gives us an x of 0, or we can use algebra by choosing a particular coordinate and solving using that algebra for our constant term. All right, now what we're going to look at, so we've looked at finding the rule from a table. We're going to see if we can identify finding a rule from a graph. Okay, so over here I have been given a graph. Each of these points are 1 unit apart, so we're going to just label that to make things easier. 3, 1, 2, 3, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3. So what I can do is I can plot these, we've got the plotted points here. I'm going to turn it into a table to make things a little bit easier to read, and we're going to check what our coordinates are. So here I've got an x value of negative 1, my y value equals negative 3. So when x is negative 1, y is negative 3. All right, next one, when x is 0, y is negative 2. So this is working backwards from what we were doing last lesson. X value of 1 gives a y value of negative 1. X value of 2 gives me a y value of 0. And then an x value of 3 gives me a y value of 2. So I can draw this like this, and now we can figure out what we were doing the same way as before. So as long as my x values are increasing by 1, I look at what's happening to my y values to go from negative 3 to negative 2 to negative 1 to 0 to, that should be a 1 actually, that point there. This is what happens when you don't measure them out without a ruler. All right, so that's a 1, which means we are now increasing by 1 each time. So we are adding one number, okay, which means my coefficient is now going to be 1. So I can safely say that my rule is going to be y equals my coefficient, which is 1 times x. And now we've got to figure out our constant term. So when x is 0, what is y? Y is negative 2. So that is going to be y equals 1x, take away 2. Remember, in algebra, if you've got a 1 in front of your letter, you can just write it like so. You don't have to include the 1 because we can assume that there's already only one of them there. So we can do it this way, drawing our coordinates, or what we can do is we can see straight from our graph, when x is 0, what is my y value, or what is my y-intercept? And that is at negative 2. So straight away, this constant term is going to be whatever number my graph cuts the y-axis at. So this value is always going to be our y-intercept. So our constant term is going to be our y-intercept, as long as it's written in this format. We're going to do a little bit more work on identifying the rule in our following videos. If this made sense, please give this video a thumbs up. Leave a comment below if you want me to clarify anything. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day.